Good morning. We are on Mem Vav Amud Aleph 46a. And I'm trying to find my place here. If you go to the widest set of lines and you count 3 lines down, the line starts the word gufa. Robert's messaging me if we have a class. I'm telling you we are on, yes. And just starting.
Where's the word?
The third line of the widest set of lines, and the word is gufa. The word gufa, which translates as body, is a way of the Gemara's way of saying as per that item itself. So in this context, as it is often just putting these words out there so we understand when we see these words, we know what they mean. Those words have like a broad meaning in the Gemara very often, in the jargon, the parlance of the Gemara. So gufa means to that thing itself. So oftentimes in a discussion, the Gemara will raise a text to make a point, and the Gemara will conclude the point being made in relation to that text that it raised. And then having concluded the point it tried to make, the Gemara will then say, now, as for that text itself, let's look at that. And that's the word gufa means. As for that text itself. So what is the text? So gufa. As for that text itself, which we raised earlier in connection with our earlier discussion. The quote we read that the Gemara now wants to analyze reads as follows. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said the name of Rav. So let's give ourselves a little historical context to understand what's going on, just to place everybody in their like where we are. So let's just imagine we, as we're reading this, is we're the redactors of the Gemara. Just imagine. So we're living in Babylonia, let's say 400 years or so after the time the temple is destroyed. And we're analyzing texts of the Mishnah. And then we're also analyzing texts of those sages from post the Mishnah to us here at the redaction point in history. Now, the sage quoted here is of Yehuda in the name of Rav. And Rav is of the first generation of the scholars of the Gemara. So us, the redactors, we're talking almost 2 centuries before us, maybe 2.5 centuries, even early. It could be even earlier, depending on which point in redaction. But we could be up to 250 years after the person speaking here. So to us, it's almost as authoritative as a Mishnah. So we have Rav as a student of Rabbi Yochanan, who himself is a student of Rabbi Yehuda, the author of the Mishnah. So we're talking about the first generation of the Gemara age. And us, many years later, are looking at what he said and trying to understand it. So that's what we have here. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rav, quote, Hiniach Allah oida shel sakin. If a person placed upon the paraduma, we're familiar with the paraduma? Yeah? The red cow that's meant to be burned, slaughtered and burned, and then the ashes are used to purify someone in contact with dead body. So Rav said, if you place upon it a sack of anything, really, whatever it is, psula, it's now disqualified because the cow did work. It carried something. Not just if it carried, you place something on it. Right? And the as per the Torah's description, the paraduma is disqualified if it did any work. Now, uba egla, when we talk about the egla rufa, you're familiar with the egla rufa, this is the main discussion here, which is when there's a unresolved murder out in the field somewhere, they bring a young calf, decapitate the calf, and they do a ritual of cleansing for the people for not having looked after this person. So this calf also is disqualified if it did work prior to the ritual. But said Rabbi Yehuda Mara, said Rav, Acha Timshoich, it's not disqualified if you placed a yoke on it or placed a sack of anything on it, but only if you pulled it. So it had to have done work. So this is Rabbi Yehuda and Rav's statement. This is Rav's statement. When it comes to paraduma, disqualification is even if you placed a, I don't want to say the word yoke, which is the wrong word. Even if you placed an object, let's just say that. You placed something on it, even if the cow didn't move. The fact that you put something on its back disqualified the paraduma. When it comes to the aglarufa, it's only disqualified if it carried that yoke. So you pulled it. Or carried that burden. So pulled it. Oh, good morning, Robert. Didn't miss a lecture. We're just bringing us to speed. Yeah. How did we get to this conclusion? That when it comes to the paraduma, even if you place something on it, it's disqualified. When it comes to the aglarufa, it's only disqualified if you pull it. So we came to this conclusion as follows. Because the verse, when it describes the disqualification of work for the paraduma, says the Torah, Ashaloi Allah Allah oil, upon which no yoke was placed. So when it comes to the paraduma, it only just says yoke. But it also says, even if it's placed on it. So if we were to isolate paraduma, we would conclude a yoke, even if you don't pull it, if it's placed on it, it's disqualified. But if you place the sack of potatoes, it's not disqualified. Because the Torah only says yoke. But then we have eglarufa. And by eglarufa, it says two things. It says, number one, asher lo yu'ubadba, in which no work was done. The word work is not limited to yoke, it's any work. Even carrying a package. But then it also says, asher lo yumshach ba'oil. It was never drawn by a yoke. So when it describes paradum, when it describes eglarufa, it expands it to beyond yoke, to be any work, but specifies that you have to have pulled it. You have to have done some work with it and not just placed upon it. So there's a stringency in paraduma, and that even if it wasn't worked, even if it was just placed, but the leniency is that it's only yoke. So tells us Rav Yehuda, what you do is you take the stringency of eglarufa, which says that work goes beyond yoke, and you transfer to paraduma. But when you transfer to paraduma, you bring it to paraduma standards, which is even if you placed upon it, even if it wasn't drawn. So we're going beyond yoke, but on its level, which is even if you placed upon it. And thus it concludes, and when it comes to eglarufa, you have to pull it for it to be disqualified. It has to have carried the burden, not just have the burden placed on it. When it comes to paraduma, any burden placed upon it is already disqualifying. The fact that it's even if it's placed upon it is because of the verse itself, which says, upon which no yoke was placed. And the fact that we're going to expand beyond yoke to other packages comes from eglarufa. Even though in eglarufa, the extra packages are only if you pull it, not if it's just placed. And that's going to become the Gemara's discussion. How do we take from eglarufa and then expand it beyond itself? We're taking from eglarufa by making it more stringent than eglarufa. How could you do that? This is going to be the Gemara's discussion.
Only the stringent parts, not the.
That's right. You're taking its law, but then making it worse than its source.
Right. You mentioned this a few classes back.
And we said we're going to discuss it later.
Yeah, right.
This is the later.
This is the later.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so says the Gemara, we're on involvement base. Involvement Badala, 46a. Here, I'll show you the place. 3 lines down from the widest set of lines, third to last word. So 3 lines down, third to last word, Meisvei. So Meisvei, we're going to challenge Yehuda's Rav's position. Whenever you have the word Meisvei, I mentioned this before, excuse me. Whenever you have the word Meisvei as an introduction to a question, it means the question is going to be based on citing a verse greater than the one speaking. So the one speaking here is Rav. I mentioned that he was from the first generation of scholars from the Gemara's era, from Amoraim as they're called. So he's an Amora. So he's an early Amora. He comes from the first generation of Gemara scholars, nonetheless still is a scholar of the Gemara. And therefore, if we're going to say Meisvei, we're going to challenge him from a text that's greater than himself, that means that we're going to quote a Mishnaic text. So without the Gemara saying it's a Mishnaic text, from the fact that the Gemara said Meisvei, I know it's a Mishnaic text. And I know it's going to conclude as soon as the Gemara switches from Hebrew to Aramaic. There's a little trick to know when the text concludes. Right. So I know it's happening. It says Meisvei, means the challenger is challenging from a source above it, which means Rav is an Amora. By the way, how do I know Rav is an Amora? Even if you don't know, I happen to know historically where Rav stands. But how do you know by the text itself to know if it's an Amora or not?
It's not Rabbi.
It's not Rabbi. and it's a Rav Yehuda, not Rabbi Yehuda. So if it's a Tana, it's a Rabbi. If it's an Amida, it's a Rav. These are little like things and you know how to place things. So if the person speaking is Rav, it must be an Amida, a scholar from the Gemara. Then the Gemara says, Meisvei, I'm challenging you from a text greater than yourself. You must be quoting from a Mishnaic text. Right? Otherwise, it would be Rami. Rami is a contradiction between two equal state questions. If it would be a logical challenge, it would be Maskif. Right? If it would be an inquiry, it would be Bayi. Right? So if it's Meisvei, I know it's quoting the text greater than itself. And because I know it says a Rav, and therefore it's an Amida, therefore you must be quoting a Mishnah. And at which point do I know the Mishnah concludes? But as soon as the Gemara switches to Aramaic. Because that means the narrator, the redactor, is now analyzing. So knowing these little things, that's right. And I'm going to keep on reminding us about these things because it helps us learn tips and how to be able to learn the Gemara. Okay, so basically, we're going to cite to Mishnaic text, which now seems to contradict Rav's statement. And Rav, being from the post-Mishnaic era, from the Amida era, must accept that which it states in a Mishnaic text. So what the Gemara is going to do now is the Gemara is going to quote the Mishnaic text, analyze it for a bit, and then explain its question. So for the next couple of lines, we're going to put a pin in what Rav said, put it aside, look at these texts, understand it, and then we're going to come back to the contradiction that the Gemara is raising. So here's the Mishnaic text. It reads, oil. The verse says, when it comes to paraduma, asher loy Allah aleh oil. Take a cow, upon which no yoke was placed, or upon which was not placed a yoke. Better translation, because that's going to become relevant. Upon which was never placed a yoke. That's the direct translation. So, ainli ella oil. At this juncture, all I have to disqualify the paraduma is a yoke. Shara voidois, and the other work that the animal might have done, minayin. From where do I know that it also disqualifies the paraduma? So the Gemara's, this Mishnaic text is doing the same, is asking the same question that Rabbi Yehuda answered. Right? Rabbi Yehuda told us to compare it to Egla Rufa. This Mishnaic text is going to do a similar thing, also compare to Egla Rufa, but from a different angle, and that's going to become our question. Okay, so from the text of paraduma itself, all I know is that a yoke disqualifies the paraduma. Shara this other services minayin. From where do I know that it disqualifies the paraduma? So amris kalvochemer. We're going to say how much to the morso. How much to the morso from Egla Rufa? Uma Egla, just when it comes to the Egla Rufa. She'emum poiselba. Where a blemish is not a disqualifying factor, which means it's lenient. It's more lenient than the paraduma. Right? Because the paraduma may not have a blemish. The Egla Rufa may have a blemish. So it's lenient. And yet, it has a stringency, shara voidus poislisba, that other works disqualify it beyond just yoke. So para, therefore, the red heifer, the paraduma, shemum poisaba, which is more stringent because it is disqualified by a blemish. In adin, is it not therefore logical, sheshara voidus poislinba, that other works should invalidate it, should disqualify it? So far, it's pretty consistent with Rav Yehuda. Yeah, which is a kavachemer, right?
When you go to kavachemer, does it have, I guess it doesn't have to, but I'm asking, does it have to be the same item? In other words, the leniency?
Yes. Your baseline of leniency and stringency must be the same. That's correct. Yes, it does. That's a very good point. So, when you compare leniency to stringency, they have to be of the same type.
Right.
And right now it is blemish to blemish. Leniency by Egla Rufa, no blemish disqualifier. Stringency by a paraduma blemish is a disqualifier, and thus we have Egla Rufa being lenient, paraduma be strict, and yet this lenient one has a stringency, and thus we transfer the stringency to the stringent one.
On the other item,
that's correct.
Okay.
That's right. But the baseline is.
So you are at first comparing the blemish.
That's correct. At first, you're establishing that one is lenient and one is stringent, using the same law. And then because now that we know which one's lenient and which one's stringent, one of the lenient one has a stringency, I can transfer it to the stringent one. Now that's important because, okay, we'll see in a minute why it's important, but that's very good you raised that. It's very good you raised that because we're going to see in a moment. Okay, but we're not done the Mishnah text yet, right? So the Mishnah text is still speaking, but so far the Mishnah text is somewhat consistent with Rav, right? Now Rav said we took from Egla Rufa to expand the disqualifying work to beyond yoke and bringing it to Paraduma. So far, good. Yeah. But then the Mishnah text continues. Now, v'im nafshach leimar, if you'd like, I will tell you. Nafshach means like nefesh, like self, and nafshach means yourself. So v'im nafshach, if it comes to yourself, leimar to say, that for some reason you don't like this kal v'chomer, you don't like the a fortiori, you don't like the how much of the more so, right? Which means the Mishnah text is opening a window to discounting the kal v'chomer. And it's on us to figure out what that is, because the Mishnah does not explain itself. This Mishnah text. But it says as follows. Im nafshach leimar, should you like, I can tell you the following. Okay, so for some reason you don't like the kal v'chomer. So I'll tell you, leimar, we can say as follows. Nemar kan oil, we'll make a gzera shava. So if you don't like the kal v'chomer, I have a gzera shava. Nemar kan oil, it says here with respect to paraduma, oil, yoke. The nemar lahalon, and it says there with respect to egla rufa, oil, yoke. Just as when it comes to egla rufa, where the word oil, the word yoke is used, and yet it states explicitly that other works also disqualify it. Afkan, so to here by paraduma, where it has the same word yoke, oil, yoke, other works will disqualify it. So this Mishnah here gives us two options. Kal v'chomer, and that's the way you'll take from paraduma. You'll take from egla rufa to paraduma. But if you don't like that, no problem. I have a gzera shava. That there's two words that are the same, and therefore they transfer. Very strange text, giving me options and how to derive what's going on. So before the Gemara gets to this question of why this is a contradiction to Rav, the Gemara is going to first analyze the text and say, well, why would I reject the kal v'chomer? What's wrong with it? You're giving me a gzera shava because you're suggesting that I might reject the kal v'chomer. Why would I reject it? Yeah. So the Gemara is now going to give two options for why I would reject the kal v'chomer. Okay? Says the Gemara. Mayim nafshach leimar. So now I know the Gemara is talking now. Because the way the Gemara asked the question is may. May is an Aramaic word. Following? Which, look, may is like what is. So it's Babylonia. The redactors are now looking at this. They must be also after Rab. So they're in the later generations of Maroyim. They have a text from Rab and they have a text from Mishnah, and they're trying to figure out how to reconcile. Right? So my im nafshach leimar. Okay. Sorry. They'll figure it out. Okay, my im nafshach leimar. What is the meaning of, like, what's the meaning of, if you want, you can say, what's wrong with the kal v'chomer? Says the Gemara, I'll give you two options. For chitema, should you like, you can say the following is a counter argument to the kal v'chomer. Ikal mifrach, you can counter argue and say, and this is to the point you were making, very important. Mala egla, when you make a kal v'chomer, right, you start off with the premise that there's a law in which here they're stringent and here it's lenient. And because one's stringent, one lenient, then if the lenient one has a stringency, I transfer. But what if I discover the lenient one is not actually lenient? It's more stringent in other areas. So now I can't make the kal v'chomer. A kal v'chomer has to be that on a premise, one is stringent, one is equal, and yet despite the leniency, it has a stringency, and that's what transfers that stringency. But what if it has two stringencies? Which means inherently it's not more lenient than the other guy. It's actually more stringent. Because look, it has two stringencies. Following? You follow that?
What are the two stringencies?
So let's see. Ma'ala egla, when it comes to egla rufa, shekain shanum paiselasba. Age is a factor. Age is a factor. So egla rufa carries two stringencies. So to tell me that as a rule, Egla Rufa is more lenient, and yet it has a stringency, and if the stringency should be transferred, as a rule, it's not lenient. It's actually more stringent, considering the fact that age is an issue. If it's older than 1 or 2 years old, depending on the opinion, it's invalid. And yet by Paradum, it could be as old as you want. And therefore, your premise of your Kal Vachomer, which is this one's more stringent and this one's more lenient, is not true. Because Egla Rufa, as a rule, is not more lenient. It's actually more stringent. So that's option 1 to refute the Kal Vachomer. Inami, or I can suggest another reason why to refute the Kal Vachomer, which is like this. When you have, okay, let's just assume that one's more lenient, one's more strict on one set of laws. In this case, mum. Paradum was more stringent on mum, that blemish invalidates, and which is mum is a blemish, and Egla Rufa is not disqualified by blemish. Yeah, okay, we established that. But what if I introduce another law which shares the stringency of paraduma, in that it's also disqualified by blemish, but doesn't share the stringency of no work? So it doesn't share the stringency that I'm trying to transfer. If that's the case, then that means from Torah thinking, the leniency and the stringency doesn't stack upon each other. Follow? The premise of the Kal Vachomer is like this: if something is not disqualified by blemish, and yet is disqualified by lack of work, by work, then anything which is disqualified by blemish, considering that you're more stringent, must also carry the disqualification of work. But what if I discover that's not the case? There are situations in which blemish is a factor and yet work is not, indicating like
the korbanot.
Beautiful. That's what the Gemara does. The Gemara says the korbanos counteract your Kal Vachomer. Your Kal Vachomer is built on the premise that if something is disqualified by blemish, it must also be disqualified by work, considering the fact that Egla Rufa is not disqualified by blemish and yet is still disqualified by work. But I'm going to show you a law in which we are disqualified by blemish and yet not disqualified by work. And therefore they don't stack upon each other. And therefore no Kal Vachomer.
Didn't we discuss this earlier?
Not in the context of paraduma.
not.
We did so in the context of Egla Rufa. But now the Gemara is
the Salka.
Salka Daitach. Yes, that's right.
That you shouldn't do the moment.
But that was to Egla Rufa. Now we're doing it to paraduma. So let's see.
They're using the same logic.
Yeah.
Why not to use the
That's right.
Kal Vachomer, just applying it to paraduma?
Yeah. So the Gemara is like this. Inami. Here's the other option for the refutation of the Kal Vachomer. The first refutation was, well, to begin with, I'm not so convinced that Egla Rufa is more lenient because it has a stringency of age factor. Number 2, I'm not so convinced that having blemish as a disqualifier means that you have to have work as a disqualifier, because kachim yerchichu, karbonis will disprove that. Shemum paisel behen, where kachim karbonis are disqualified by blemish, ve'ein avoda paiselas behen, but work does not disqualify it.
Not even consecrated.
That's correct.
Unless it's
Even if it's consecrated, even if it's been consecrated, and after consecration you do work, it still doesn't disqualify it. And even if you did work that was not kosher work on Shabbos or whatever. Says the Gemara, therefore the Mishnah text tells us, Nemar kan oil, therefore you have to go with Gzeir Shava. And Gzeir Shava transcends these distinctions. If there's a Gzeir Shava which says this law is compared to this law because of associated word, and by tradition the words are associated, the law is transferred irrespective of leniencies and stringencies, because Torah says to transfer. Namely, Nemar kan oil, it says here, have a good day, it says here with respect to Egla Rufa. I'm sorry, with paraduma. It says with respect to paraduma, the word yoke, no work placed upon it. And it says there with respect to Egla Rufa, oil, yoke, malahalon, sharavoides, just as when it comes to Egla Rufa, yoke does not mean yoke, but any work beyond yoke. Avkan. So to here with paraduma, sharavoides, yoke doesn't mean yoke, it means beyond yoke too. So now this is the Gemara done explaining the Mishnah. Now the Gemara is done Have a good day. Now that the Gemara is done explaining the text, now it gets back to its question, which is as follows. With my Rashi. Yeah. Now the Gemara explains the question, which is like this. Your question, the question we've been asking until now. Now the Gemara kind of finally articulates it, which is as follows. I lost my place. Okay. But from the very place that you derived, we are deriving whether you're at the Rav Yehuda level, which is the Kal V'chomer, which we kind of refuted in this Mishnaic text, or whether you're at the Gzeira Shava level. From the very place that you come, namely, you taking the law that Paraduma is disqualified by work beyond yoke. Where did you come from that? You came from that. You came to that from Egla Rufa. Then let's look at how Egla Rufa works. Malahalon, just as there, the disqualifier is only once you draw and pull the animal, not just when it's placed upon it.
It's not bilateral.
It's not. What's sorry?
Sorry.
What do you mean not bilateral?
Like transferring from Paraduma.
Okay, that we already settled. That's not bilateral. That we discussed in the last few classes, right? Because here the question is, from the place that you are deriving the law, you're taking from Egla Rufa, that the definition of yoke is beyond yoke.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, when it comes to the place from which you took that definition, there it's not disqualified until you actually pull the Egla Rufa. That's the disqualification. Afkan, and so to here by Paraduma, it should be limited to till you pull it.
All right, I see.
That's right.
Taking everything, because that's the definition.
You have to draft. It's right. You can't go more stringent from the. You cannot take more stringent than the place from which you took the law. Now, this is specifically a Meisvei, right? I told you before that Meisvei is you cite to a higher text that contradicts the lower text.
Right. So
How is that? How's that? Because the Mishnaic text did not explicitly state this distinction. That by Egla Rufa, it's only disqualified once you pull it. By Paraduma, it's only disqualified when it's disqualified even if you place it upon it. The Mishnaic text didn't do that. The Mishnaic text just gave us two options in how you derive the law from Egla Rufa.
Mm-hmm.
If we look at the Mishnaic text directly, what did it say? From where do I know that other works disqualify? Without saying that it has, even if it's placed or if it's pulled. And thus leaving us with the assumption that this Mishnaic text is of the view that indeed Paraduma is only disqualified if you pull the animal. Because you came from Egla. Whereas Rav Yehuda Marab explicitly states, no, you take from Egla and yet you get more stringent than Egla. And therefore there's the contradiction to Rav. So this is not just, it's not just a logical thing. In other words, the Gemara is not asking a maskif. It's not just that the Gemara is saying, by logical reasoning of Yehuda, you need to justify yourself. Because how could you take a law from Egla Rufa and be more stringent than Egla Rufa? But it's actually by contradiction of a higher source. Because the higher source uses the words, and from where do we know that work disqualifies Paraduma beyond yoke? Implying that you have to have actually done work, not just placed upon it. And that Mishnaic text answers what we took from Egla by two options, either by Gzeira Shava or by Kal V'chomer. But either way, that Mishnah only uses work with the Paraduma as a disqualifier, not placing it upon it. Because that Mishnah seems to be consistent. You're taking it from Egla Rufa, keep it at the level of Egla Rufa, which is work. But you, Rav Yehuda, you've gone a step further and said we're taking from Egla Rufa, and yet going beyond Egla Rufa and saying even if you place upon it, it disqualifies the Paraduma. And that is a contradiction to the Mishnaic understanding of the comparison to Egla Rufa. Clear on the Gemara's question? Yeah. So it's not just a logical thing which Rav Yehuda can respond with a logical answer. It's a contradictory thing. And it's important. Well, okay, I'll tell why it's important in a second, but you want to ask something?
Is it because I'm just trying to see if I can understand why that would be? Would it be because when you're taking from Egla Rufa, you're transferring by way of Gzeira Shava,
or Kal V'chomer, whichever one.
No, but in this case, Gzeira Shava.
Okay, let's see Gzeira Shava.
You can't discard the verse within Paraduma that says placing. Exactly.
Which means if it was only a logical question,
right,
the Gemara could have responded, or Yehuda would respond and say, look, your logic is you can't go greater than the place you came from. And my logic is when you take words from here and you put it into paraduma, you have to go on paraduma standards because that's if it's written here. So in other words, when you go with logic, Yehuda can respond with different logic. But now that we have a Mishnaic text that disagrees with your understanding, now you have a contradiction, not just a refutation logically. You have a higher source text that understands it differently than you. So you understand it as I'm taking the law from Egla Rufa, I'm sticking into Paraduma, and therefore putting it on a Paraduma standards. But this Mishnaic text doesn't do that. This Mishnaic text does the same transfer, but leaves it at work, not placing. So now it's not just a question of you explaining how you understand it. It's a question of you, Rav Yehuda, justifying yourself against the text that's a century before you. That's the issue here. So it's a meisvei, not a maskif. It's a contradiction from a text greater than Rav Yehuda, not a contradiction based on how do you explain yourself. Because as you just said, you could explain yourself. I'm making the Gzer Shava, I'm taking words out from here, I'm placing it in here. And once I place it in here, I get to the standard of here, which is how we understood it to begin with. But now we're seeing a Mishnaic text that doesn't do that. So there's a source greater than you, Rav, from a century earlier, from a decade earlier, or whatever. Not a decade. It's got to be at least 2 generations before you, specifically from the Mishnaic era, that transfers the law from Egla Rufa, but without making it greater than Egla Rufa. So Rav, you don't just have to explain yourself. You have to justify yourself.
So the Mishnah text is not making it greater than Egla.
No, because the wording here is
justify why that is.
That's sorry.
Then we have to figure out a way how to make that work.
Which one?
Paraduma being greater than.
That's correct. Yeah. Correct. And not just by logic. You have logic already.
No.
But by a source that somehow can substantiate your opinion, disagreeing with the source that's higher than you. Which is what the Gemara is going to do. The Gemara is going to introduce tomorrow, God willing, a new Mishnaic text, which demonstrates that there is a dispute, even in the Mishnaic era. And therefore, Rav can say, that text disagrees with me because I follow that text. This is a response to.
No, the two equal Mishnaic.
Oh, so there's a dispute? That would have been a Rami, actually. But the Rami would have been if they're both the same people talking.
Oh,
if it's not the same people talking, then it's just a dispute.
Oh, okay.
So that's what that's what the Gemara is going to do tomorrow. It's actually a Mishnaic dispute. And Rav taking one opinion, which is perfectly fine. Rav can take one opinion within the Mishnaic dispute. But at the moment, we have only one text which contradicts Rav's view, and thus the Gemara is with this question. So that, God willing, this response coming tomorrow, we'll see the Mishnaic text indicating there's actually a Mishnaic dispute about whether Paraduma gets more strict than Egla Rufa or not.
Okay.
And once we have a Mishnaic dispute, Rav can choose one. Clear? Okay. Have a wonderful day, Yidden.
Right.
Today's Thursday, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So tomorrow we'll see tomorrow. Good day.